we've had good interaction throughout the day anyway, so I think we should be good. So just to let you know, we're going live in like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And I'll do a thumbs up. Okay, we're live. Wendy, over to you.
Good afternoon. Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome back to the afternoon session. We are joined by Alan, who is the founder of a fabulous company called BrewGooder. So Alan is going to be talking about Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. The reason that we asked Alan to come on board today is, for us, he is an absolutely fabulous example of a business in action that is taking action towards not just this particular sustainable development goal, a number of them, but primarily fits into this category. What we love most about Alan's organization is the fact that they term their mission as a simple mission. And, you know, BrewGooder is their simple mission is providing clean water to 1 million people through the sales of craft beer, donating 100% of their profits to clean water charities. So it's a really fantastic example of a business in action. Alan, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, if you want to kick off and give us a bit of a background on you, the company, and what inspired you, that would be a great way to kick things off.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everybody out there who is let me into their kitchen table, their bedroom, their living room, their office in the shed. It's awesome to be invited to speak at such an amazing event. And for me, the journey to what BrewGooder is now started when I was a little bit younger. I was 22 years old and I just finished university. Just graduated from the University of Glasgow, and I decided to do some volunteering to kind of just see what the outside world was like outside of the student bubble, and to, you know, fill out a CV for what could be a potential career elsewhere. And when I came to actually go into the job market, and for me that was sort of spoke to a lot of the different things that I wanted to do with my life. When I grew up, my mum was a sort of nursing assistant within the NHS, and I always felt that it was probably something I'd like to do, to kind of just use whatever skills I had to help others in some way. And volunteering abroad and at home in Glasgow kind of appealed to me. And when I got out to Nepal, it was a female education and empowerment program in a very rural community called Chitwan on the Indian border. And I had a great time, made lots of great friends, saw the difference that projects like that can make, even, you know, if they're not the most high impact. They kind of set you on a journey to do lots of cool stuff, and to be very activist in how you see your career panning out. But one experience really stayed with me, and that was the fact that I went against all the doctor's advice, all the Foreign Office advice, my mum's advice, the people who were on the project's advice, and I just drank a water source that I didn't know was treated or sterilized or made safe, because I was a 22-year-old guy, and I just thought that you know, that sort of illnesses and things happen to other people, and I couldn't be more wrong. Within about 3 weeks of that, stuff started not working properly, and within 3 months I had to come home because I just wasn't feeling well at all. I was losing weight quite rapidly, and the things you take for granted, it's pre-watershed, so I'll not get into it, but let's just say it got kind of messy. And I was lucky enough to come home, go to the end of my street, and go to a GP, get a few tests done, which were interesting again, and get diagnosed pretty much within a week, and given a prescription for metronidazole, which is a super common antibiotic. And for me, that was like a wake-up call to the value of water, I guess. And my immediate reaction to it was, oh, when you're brushing your teeth or doing the dishes, like, don't waste the water that's, you know, going through your pipes. And very quickly that became, you know, a ridiculous way to look at it, because that wasn't an issue. That wasn't, although that's how I understood water. Water for me was something that came out of the taps pretty much on demand. But when I looked into the issue, I saw these amazing statistics, terrible statistics about infant mortality as a result of unsafe water sources. You know, depending on where you looked, it could be as recorded as high as over 1,000 kids under 5 every single day, dying from completely preventable diseases. And how I interpreted that was that there could have been somebody born on the 30th of April 1990, same day as me, that might not have got past their 5th birthday. And that was something I couldn't, like, on an existential level, kind of grapple with immediately. And that kind of said that I needed to get into this space. And the more I moved towards understanding water, I actually thought that, no, the issue is not just that from, you're in a danger zone between the age of, 0 to 5, and then suddenly, you've got through it, and that's, you're out the other side. Your whole life was determined by that. If you were a girl and you got to, menstruating in school and you had nowhere to go from a sanitary point of view, then you started to lose 25% of your school days. And if you lose 25% of anything versus your peers or colleagues, you're going to fall extremely behind. And at the time, I had 2 nieces that were both under 5, and I couldn't imagine that they would have their lives in danger as they grew up with something so essential. And that they, if they got past that danger zone, they would also still continue to have their lives impacted by this thing. So I felt like I needed to get into the water space. I needed to try and, almost from a vocational point of view, make an impact on that issue. But you're up against the fact that it's probably the most chronic and endemic of issues around the world. There's 800 million people who lack safe access to clean water, and there's even more. It's in the billions. I think it was 2.3 billion the last time I checked. A reputable source that said that that lacked access to sanitation. And I would just like to say, before I go on further, that you guys are probably more expert than I could ever be on this subject. But this is just from an intuitive point of view how I've come to terms with the issue of water. And I did what I think most people who were 22 years old and graduates would do, and they applied for a grad scheme with the Department for International Development. And I went through this big, it was like you're applying for access to the nuclear codes. Like, they would test you on everything from your quick maths to your English, all the way through to just these random things to make sure you weren't some sort of madman coming in and trying to wreck the place. And I got all the way through to the last day in the selection process, and I very quickly realized that I wasn't the smartest or hardest working or most determined person in that room. But I left feeling good because I started to play the team role guy. I started saying, "Oh, I haven't heard from you, and you look like you had something to say." And I went out and fought a boss that it turns out they didn't, and they sent me a letter a few months later saying, "We've given your job to somebody from Oxford or Cambridge," which is not what they said, but it's civil service, so that's what they meant. And I was kind of lost. I was kind of stuck. And about 3 or 4 months into searching for new jobs in any water charity that would take me, I was either overqualified or underqualified, whatever those things mean. And I was very, very frustrated. And I came across a guy in Edinburgh who just started up a social enterprise sandwich shop. And my arrogant and naive 22-year-old self was sort of saying, what would I possibly want to do to start my career in a sandwich shop? And to be honest, joining it was the most amazing experience ever, because that sandwich shop employed and fed homeless people and vulnerable people. It started as one cafe, and over the period of the 9 years that I've been involved with it, it's basically been taken from one sandwich shop to influencing the Scottish Government's policy on homelessness, implementing massive sleep out events and calling for thousands of people to be rapidly rehoused under Housing First. So through that whole process, I was like, this is amazing. You can build a brand that people can interact with on their way to work, on their way home, on the weekend, in their spare time, that you could point in a direction of activism on a certain thing. And I thought that, I would love to build something in that water space that was similar. And around about that same time, I was getting a paycheck regularly every month, and I did what I think most people in my situation do, which is to start buying better beer. I used to buy £1 pints in the student union, and now I was buying £7 cans of Cloudwater or Trillium or whatever it was. And I thought that there was something really powerful in this. And when I speak to my friends, they're any conversation on the weekend would have some element of craft beer in it, whether it was, what are you drinking? Oh, give me a taste of that. And I just thought there was such a social dynamic, a powerful social dynamic, which could cut across the antisocial aspects of how sometimes we consider beer. And I thought that wouldn't it be amazing if you could point beer in a direction of clean drinking water, not just because you can kind of on a consumer level understand that. You can understand if you get refreshed from, an ice cold lager, someone else can have access to, in that sort of equation, ice cold water, although it doesn't lend over as easy as that. I thought it was a real Trojan horse into making a difference on an issue that I thought was, could be powerfully addressed by an entire industry. So I decided to start BrewGooder in 2015. I brewed 1,000 bottles of what was Clean Water Lager version 1. 300 of them exploded in my living room, kitchen, and bedroom because I put too much brewing sugar in it. So I put basically champagne in a paper bag and it blew up. And that was another part of the journey where I thought, I don't know enough about water. I know that my intentions are good and I'll learn a lot along the way, and I'll trust other people to invest whatever money we can raise wisely and transparently. But I don't know about beer. I know about drinking beer, so I need help. And I like to try to aim for the top of the mountain, and then if you fall off, then you might fall higher than you were to climb, if that makes sense. And I wrote a letter to the guys at BrewDog. Said, listen, I want to develop a recipe. I want to sell some beer. I want to use the profits from that beer to bring people clean water. What do you think? And I somehow got a meeting with their CEO, James, shortly after the exploding bottles incident. And I didn't know anything about beer, and he could probably tell that. But after 3 questions, he kind of said, "Do you want it in cans or bottles?" And that kind of set the trajectory for what was possible with BrewGooder. We launched in 2016 on World Water Day, because why not? And we've sold roughly 3 million cans of clean water lager in the past 4 years. We've funded and co-funded around 134 different projects, from big systems projects where you're talking about 12,000 litres of water per day in these giant towers, all the way through to boreholes and well rehabilitations. And that has an effective coverage of helping to empower, I think the last sort of census that we did on it was 65,235 people. And that has been an incredible journey. But as we go on and learn more about how we can actually start to really leverage massive impact, one of the things that we're really proud of, and COVID kind of got in the way of this significantly, particularly in the UK when the lockdown came into effect on March 20th, I think, or the 21st, depending on what we look at it, which is the day before World Water Day. We had convinced 254 brewers around the world in 24 different countries to brew beer, release it in a small batch way, so that it was a one-of-a-kind, one-off thing in collaboration with us as part of a campaign called the Global Gathering. And the idea was to raise over £300,000 to be invested in various different projects in Malawi, which is where we do the most amount of work. And obviously COVID, like most things, ran a coaching horses through that. So a lot of those beers escaped into the market. But I thought that this was actually something that the whole industry could get behind. Beer is a hugely water intensive industry. I think it takes something like on the best production line, you're talking 40 or 50 litres of water to make 1 pint of beer. And that's something that we as an industry have to grapple with. And if we can in some way, although it's imperfect, repatriate that to people who need it in essence, then I think that's something that I'd love to really bring to the rest of the craft beer and hopefully the macro beer community as well. Right now we're in the position of actually redeveloping what BrewGooder does, and we have this 100% of profits message, which is in essence not going to change, but it's quite challenging to actually tell somebody how that works for a distributor of beer. that sells to a wholesaler, then the wholesaler sells to another wholesaler, then sells to a bar, then the bar sells to a customer. What proportion of that that sale when they're buying potentially a beer for £7, what portion of that ends up going on to projects? And I think that you're asking people to do lots of mental arithmetic when all they should really be doing is enjoying a beer. And so we're moving to a model of 100x. So if you have a pint of BrewGooder, it will unlock 100 litres or 100 pints, of clean water on the other end. So that's kind of where we're at the minute. I'm sure there'll be questions from Wendy and from others about how we've changed and what the challenges are. Certainly, communicating impact to and making it understood by end drinkers to whom water is very far away. That's basically where we're at now, sitting here in the end of June in 2020.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. That's a really sort of robust overview of what you guys do. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I would imagine that you guys are facing, as with most businesses at the moment, but you touched upon COVID and how that's had an adverse impact on your business. Do you also see that in terms of the impact that's having on the communities that you're supporting with clean water, or potentially those communities that may have received sort of funding for clean water, but may now not receive that as a result of the effects of COVID-19? And obviously, I would imagine a decrease in sales, especially from a retail perspective of your product. Yeah,
so there's a lot to unpack there, but the broad answer to all of that is yes. Yes, but. So I guess one of the big things is that, everyone lives in a bubble, right? I think personally, whether that bubble is positive or negative or privileged or not, I think people live within what they can understand, which is immediate to them. And when COVID happened, we thought we were unique in as much as we had worked for 6 months on this project that it literally was going to be transformative for what we had planned. So collaborations around the world, brewers shouting about water, clean water as the biggest, noisiest thing that was going to happen in craft beer, and then obviously the funds that were raised to fund projects alongside that. And then we spent about 2 weeks in shock, basically thinking that's not happening anymore, and we have to sort of shake ourselves out of it. And my immediate thing and the communication that we had to all the brewers was, do not risk your own business's survival. Because the thing that hit earliest was that although Boris Johnson didn't say, I don't know if he said don't go to these places, but he basically said don't go to bars and restaurants before he actually enforced the closure of them the week after. So people were panicking. There was business models in craft beer particularly that are just predicated on being able to sell their beer in really busy environments and to on-trade customers, and that was suddenly gone. So we kind of said, right, listen guys, don't put yourselves out on our behalf. And that was such a difficult decision to make, because you're ultimately saying that you are more important than the potential beneficiaries. And I think that that's such a juxtaposition that was very, very hard for our team to kind of wrestle with, because you're basically saying don't raise money for people who are probably, in the grander scheme of things, in a 10 times worse position that you exist in. But then we thought, no, the long term of BrewGooder is predicated on a continuous growth and a long-term business model that will continue to deliver at ever greater levels benefit and impact for people who need it. So potentially this was just a barrier in the road that we had to overcome, and I'll explain why it could be potentially a positive from our point of view in a little bit. But the big challenge for us was then, okay, right, our whole business model is predicated on this fundraising. We are in the, we go through this entire year having only funded one additional project when we were looking to fund another 100 or so with the global gathering. And it started to actually say, well, why are we pursuing this business model that, you can only, you have to wait to the end of the year to work out what your profit is in order to invest? Why can't you make every single can have impact and have a defined impact? So that's why actually this has kind of been good in a way for us to be able to say, right, We need everything to make impact from the first can or your 100th can, whatever it looks like. So this is where we have to flip our message and flip our model to make sure that we're making an impact from the very, very start. But then there was the side where, what does that impact look like? We're working in communities where we want to do as much as possible, and we want to continue to work in as much as possible. But these communities they're rural. They are, they don't have the access to primary healthcare that we would take for granted, even in situations as where there's potential overloads like COVID could have had to the NHS. I mean, that's just incomparable to some of the places in Malawi that we work in. I think one of the projects we did was a big water system into a mother and baby clinic in a village just outside Dedza in Malawi, and that's something that we herald as a kind of marquee project for us, because it enabled other development to go on around it. But of 134 projects, that was the only one that had that immediate access within a stone's throw of their village. This was something that was an impending humanitarian crisis, and like I say, we're not experts by any means, and even in water, I don't think, let alone all the other areas of development which could flesh out what that humanitarian crisis looks like. But when we were in contact with our people on the ground, they were saying, we don't want to commit to any more projects that involve our people moving around different parts of the country, because these are the people who are most likely to come in contact with people from the outside and therefore move it around. And with these incubation periods of 2 weeks, etc., you could probably commission a project which is 5 or 6 different villages within a few days, and before you know it, if something, if a big borehole drilling machine rolls into town, that's a bit where people congregate. So the whole business model, the whole impact model, is just completely thrown about. And to be honest, I'll hold my hands up and say that we haven't come to an adequate solution to that in the long term. There's different rates of transmission and infection in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly in Malawi, but a lot of that comes down to the ability to test full stop, which just doesn't exist in lots of places. So really the underlying crisis is still bubbling up, and the WHO was saying that around the world it's spiking, not receding. So the challenge will be ongoing, and we'll have to learn how to deal with that as well.
Yeah, I totally get that. So given the circumstances that obviously we're all facing at the moment, and I guess the large amount of uncertainty in terms of when your operations and your projects can begin rolling out again, do you have any advice for any of our viewers as to how they can kind of support the goal of clean water sanitation throughout this COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the most obvious one for us is buy our beer, but I don't like to say that because I don't actually think that's in an immediate sense. I think that you need to look at it as a joined up thing, to be able to support DECs or whatever it looks like in countries or communities where there is a potential health crisis, healthcare crisis, is probably an indirect way to supporting longer term aspirations for clean water development. So I can't really point to one immediate thing, unfortunately. But what I kind of would like to draw a parallel with, if you like, instead is actually that there's probably, despite the fact that water is something that is heavily invested in, if you like, from an international development point of view, from a charity point of view, fundraising has been significant for it. If you look at the likes of a WaterAid or a Charity Water or whoever, it's actually to explain that pandemics and things are of different natures. There is as much risk. I mean, this isn't scientific, but if you equate the thing, there's a pandemic going on at the minute. It has been going on for decades in clean water, and it's understanding or making it relevant. Making it something that is certainly, whenever the headlines of COVID recede, that this is something that can be pushed to the top, and to lobby your governments, your on their agendas, because we're about in the UK, tragically, to lose DFID as an independent department of government and roll it into the Foreign Office, so that our obligation, which I think is our moral obligation as much as anything else, to help develop other countries, is now being used potentially as a policy instrument, which I think is terrible. So to make sure that water gets the attention that it needs, we need to put pressure on those in power to really, deliver on what's needed. But also from a consumer point of view, for us and for other charities, is to make it relevant to people, to understand that water is not a way of keeping people alive who will otherwise die. And I think we're guilty, and certainly we were guilty of perpetuating a myth of dependency around water. If we don't give these people water, whatever will they do? I think it's actually to change the narrative and say that water is actually the first stage of empowerment towards a better life for the people and the generations that come after. Like, we talk about it being transformational, empowering, and if you look at a longer term view of it, can we come out of this crisis, this pandemic in the Western world, with a much greater understanding of how immediate life and death can be for other people, but that if we can then use that as the basis for providing the basics, the necessities that go on to empower communities and transform communities for generations, then that's something that I hope a legacy, however difficult that might be to measure, could potentially be.
And I think that you've touched upon something that seems to be sort of a common overarching theme of all of our speakers today, which is around the empowerment of communities, and not just going in and doing something and but enabling a community to be self-sufficient. And I imagine that you've got a lot of kind of real great success stories from the work that you've done with this already. And is there any kind of anecdotes or stories that you'd like to share?
Yes. So sorry. Yeah, there is. I mean, listen, there's lots that we, you can point to, and I guess that if you really dig deep into all the projects, you could probably fill an entire seminar with a discussion around that. I think there's three that kind of jump out for me. One is our first ever project in Toulouse. We went over and basically played tourist, if you like, and in kind of nefarious way, almost like it was kind of a weird situation. Before we'd started BrewGooder, we wanted to understand what water poverty looked like, or whatever way you wanted to define it, what it looked like on the ground, rather than just what we could dig out from Google. And we asked someone who ran a school out there to help us like situate ourselves in there, have a look around basically. And at the end of the trip, I noticed that we were effectively going away thinking, oh, we've got some good intel here, but we actually haven't really made a commitment to that community. And I just kind of gave an open-ended commitment of what would you like us to help you with. And there was a bit of a discussion, and effectively they'd already worked up their ask, which was awesome, which was if we could get a solar powered tank, to do X, Y, and Z. And I just said yes to it. I was like, yeah, you know what, like, let's make this happen. If we're going to do this big thing, let's make a bit of a marquee with our first ever project. So we went and we developed a tower that fed into a school feeding program that fed into the wider local community, could use effectively tapped water, which was awesome. And I think it was producing 5,000 litres a day. And when we went back a year later to see it, the community had already transformed, a bit, if you like. I'm going to use transform quite a lot in this next little bit, but it was already, you could mark the progress in construction around it. You could mark the progress in terms of how you spoke to the teachers about how many more kids were turning up for their school meal and therefore taking part in their education from a younger and younger age. Then we went back the year after, and suddenly there was a vegetable patch that was feeding, or was being used for a second feeding program, so that it wasn't just high density nutritionally whatever porridge that was being used in the morning. It was also sweet potatoes and cabbages being used in the afternoon. And then you go back the year after, and suddenly there's it's met the standard for a clinic to be built on the grounds of the school, which has piped water access. So I think that's one that we look at if we were to ever say, this is within a short period of time, the magnitude of leaps that can happen because a community can empower themselves. In essence, they just have that initial investment in a stable water source that's sustainable. The second one is probably then Molere Primary School in the Highlands of Malawi, where we work with the One Foundation to do a school sanitation project, so VIP toilets for girls, and the absentee rate for girls dropped by 90%. And that's awesome. Like, I have two nieces that I'm fortunate to think, I'm sure like everyone who has sons and daughters thinks, or nieces and nephews thinks they're the best thing in the world and the most intelligent, X, Y, and Z. But I just imagine that if they were ever in a similar situation, if they were able to continue to go to school, continue to achieve, etc., that would be a wonderful thing. So to allow that to happen, or not to allow it to happen, but to be involved with that happening somewhere where that education is really, really needed is awesome. And then the third one, and listen, I like telling the story, but also don't, because I think it taps into some of the dependency narratives that I actually think are quite unhelpful, but it's the truth, so I'll tell you it anyway. There was I think it was a village called Pindani in Theolo in Malawi. And we went, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a construction from start to finish of a borehole. And we went into this community, and there was lots of fanfare. And we got off the bus, and whatever way it works out, you're overwhelmed by the culture shock of it, by the difference of how you're received. You're quite conscious that you're there from outside the community, going into the community, and there is, I find that quite problematic. I'm quite shy in public around things like that, so it took me a wee while to adjust to it. But a gentleman came over, and he must have been in his 60s, and he was dressed up really nice, and he was a sort of elder of the village, and he came up and he said thank you, and that was it. And like, he sort of grabbed both my hands, and I had to go behind the bus that we came in and just kind of take 5 to myself, because it was only then that I realized that gentleman had kind of grown up his whole life without having something that we take for granted in his community. And with what he had to be able to express a gratitude or a thanks or whatever it was, he made that statement. And that from that day, somebody who had been born, or a young person who would be too young to remember it, would effectively take that thing for granted, and then be able to build upon that their own idea of what a good life would look like. And I think that for me is the big thing, is that if you invest correctly in any type of positive thing, you start to then just basically snowball the effect of transformational empowerment, whatever you want to call it, for future generations. Because I particularly find that I was born in Northern Ireland after, just as the Troubles were ending, and I've never had to know the suffering that people had before me, who built this peace process, and who built all these amazing things around me that I kind of take for granted. And I think that that's the duty of people, whatever sector they're working in, to kind of lay the foundations for other people to go on and achieve things that would have been unrealistic almost for your own self. So they're probably the 3 things that I would point to.
Interesting. So yeah, I guess for me, when I look at the UN SDGs, I think I totally agree with what you're saying, in the sense of water is something that I think that we all too commonly take for granted. When you look at these goals and how they're broken down, for me, I feel that the water is one of the goals which almost underpins almost everything else, in terms of that knock-on effect that having clean water can have on communities. Like you've touched upon, an education perspective of having clean water and sanitation to allow girls to actually go to school, or throughout the month and receive a proper education, down to, life on land and, on all of these things. So where do you think, outside of the clean water and sanitation, where do you think is the greatest knock-on effect that BrewGooder has in relation to the SDGs?
Yeah, so there's I would agree with you totally, obviously on that point, but I would also point to the fact that I love, well, I don't know if that's the right term, but I think there's an intersectionality of all of this. And I think that the pivot points, the two bits for me that I think go hand in hand, are water and gender equality. I think that that pivot point of being able to build in, whether it's a sanitation, clean water, whatever it is, empowerment of women in communities at the same time as you're delivering water, is this silver bullet type thing that can unlock pretty much anything. Listen, I'm happy to be challenged by that for sure, but I think those two things for me would be where the smart money for BrewGooder would be. In terms of where we can make the most difference, I think we make the most difference on the consumer face, the retail side of what we do, right? And I don't literally mean going into co-op and buying, a 4-pack. I mean, when we are more visible than we probably should be within an industry that has never really understood, not through their own fault, but has never particularly understood or interacted with a SDG in any other way as what we've done with BrewGooder. So what I would love to point to is, yes, hundreds of millions of litres unlocked per year. Yes, lots of communities transformed, over decades, 1 million people with clean water that go on to then build better lives for themselves, for sure, of course. But what I would also be conscious of is that we need to use what we are building up to reframe the narratives around sustainable development, and to be able to get people to engage with it in their everyday life around something that is outside of their everyday life. Because let's face it, we're selling to a very privileged few percent of the population of the world in order to highlight something that they can do in a very, let's call it lazy way, I guess, a passive way, to impact the lives of people who are much less privileged than they are, or much less fortunate than they are. And I think that it's about how can we turn both the narrative of, dependency into a narrative of empowerment. And we've made lots of commitments, we formalized them post the death of George Floyd, around our anti-racism, and not just being non-racist as a company, but actively being anti-racist. And one of those central pillars was to say that, we have to stop making it out a culture of dependency, or that Africa in particular, because of where we do our work, is dependent on us. And by us, I don't mean just BrewGooder, but I mean the West, blah, blah, blah. So we have to start speaking about narratives that are about empowerment, and look what you can do when. I think that's kind of, for us, a massive thing. And then the other thing is to turn that passiveness into activism. So can we really engage with people in a way that makes them take ownership of their impact? And then that becomes something that's just assumed within them. So if you take the example that I had just at the start in the intro around homelessness. So we went from a cafe chain that allowed people to come in off the street to pay for a suspended food or coffee item for a homeless person to come and claim after the shops were closing or during service. And we turned those people who would commit £3, £2, £5, whatever it was for that. And we took them on a journey of sleeping out in Edinburgh in, -3 conditions with, 12,000 other people, to raise money and raise awareness to ask the Scottish Government to change their approach to homelessness, which succeeded. So it's about how can brands like us, who aren't charities, who aren't asking for direct contributions, and will increasingly be not framing themselves like that, but like sustainable businesses, sustainable brands that people want to react with. How can we take those people on a journey from, oh, that's a nice thing, I'll have a pint of that, to being an activist? And part of that activism is actually to say, if I can do it, and I literally mean this is coming from a guy whose bottles of beer were exploding in his living room. If I can do that, imagine what somebody who's smarter, more intelligent, thinks things through more, has a better eye for design, et cetera, could do in their local and global community. And I think that local activism will inspire global activism, and I think global activism will inspire local activism as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those inspiring words. I'm sure that the viewers today should take some inspiration away with that. Yeah, you bring.
I think we might have lost Wendy on the connection.
Oh no, I thought that was just me.
No. So give her a minute or two to hop back on, but really, really fantastic insights, Alan. I had a question for you. You know, I have no problem with beer. I love BrewGooder, but this is a question that I often come up against when you kind of look at products that are promoting a sustainable message. But then, do you ever feel resistance from people who say, well, actually, you're an alcoholic drink. Should you be advocating this? Da 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 da. Like, I'm just interested to know, how do you overcome those sorts of challenges from the public or your stakeholders or stuff like that?
Yeah, listen, I think we have to get over it in a certain way. One of the things we're committed to is that, like, the alcohol industry, the beer industry, is one of the biggest industries on the planet. If we choose not to engage with it, we are missing the opportunity to make allies out of, an industry worth trillions. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if it is trillions, but it's certainly in the double-digit billions. So we would be, I think, negligent if we had an idea that was workable not to engage in that way. But one of the things we're quite consistent on is that our beers are actually, when you think about them, the most responsible and sustainable they could be. From everything from the elimination of plastics in our packaging, through to the use of cans instead of bottles, through to the fact that our beers, certainly our core beers, are 4.5% ABV and lower, so that we would want people to drink less alcohol, but enjoy beer just as normally. But yeah, listen, it's a challenge, and we get, so we did this campaign at the start of the lockdown, effectively called One on Us, and it was where we got drinkers to buy 4 packs of beer and leave messages for NHS workers and, like, frontline emergency services workers.
I love that. Yeah.
And it was really cool, right? And if you get it, you get it, okay? But it went on, it got picked up by the BBC, and now the NHS workers had to self-register to get the beer, right? We weren't just handing it out on the street, right? It was totally, like, contract free, all this sort of stuff. And it went on BBC. And of course, like, the likes and the reshares and all that sort of stuff were huge. And the comments were maybe a couple of hundred, but they were outweighed by the likes and the heart reacts and the positive, like, retweets and whatever. But it's human nature to read through the comment section. And almost every single section that wasn't criticizing me for trying to make a fast buck from it, even though we did it at cost price, was the second most common one was, this is promoting alcoholism, this is promoting, how can nurses drink on the job and fight COVID? And they just didn't get it. And I think that you have to apply a measure of reasonability to everything. Yes, we work in with a challenging product because of the harm alcohol can do, but we are probably at the forefront of trying to take something which has, inherent antisocial vices, 100%, but to acknowledge them, to transform them into something that actually can flip how people see beer. Because when I see beer, yeah, I understand that there's violence and there's abuse and there's, of yourself and others that can be related to alcohol. But certainly those things have wider roots in mental health and in inequality and in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And I think working in homelessness, I've seen that type of thing materialize. But ultimately, when I look at beer, I look at it to catch up with my friends, to celebrate things, to enjoy with other people. And I think it's inherently, as well as having this bad side to it, there's a huge positive side to it. And if we can point that entire industry in a direction that actually benefits the world at large, then we're going to unashamedly go after that.
I totally agree with that sentiment, 100%. We have Wendy back. Here we go.
Oh, is she frozen again?
Not sure what happened there, guys. Yeah, but no, I would agree with that as well. And I think, alcohol is something that has been around for centuries, and I don't think it's ever going to go anywhere. I think there's plenty of people out there that have got, beer and alcohol brands that aren't, doing it, well, anything towards sustainability, supporting and empowering communities. It's a shame that some of the messaging that you put out there is slightly maybe misconstrued by people. Like you say, perceive it in a different respect. But I guess that's one of the challenges that we all face in what we do. Certainly, in Gone West capacity in tree planting, we sort of struggles that people think that tree planting is good. How do you keep morale up, and how do you keep you motivated up when you get sort of feedback like that from people?
Yeah, your first reaction is to write something furious back to them. Like, that's for damn sure. I mean, the amount of, I always say that my draft box is like, my skeletons in the cupboard. If anyone ever read them, like, I would be in trouble, because you have to vent it, because ultimately if you don't have your initial emotional reaction, then you're not human. I work really hard, my team work even harder for this, and when people slate you, but then I just realized that it's a snowflake in a blizzard. Like, no one will care about those types of criticisms, and I certainly won't care if we go and do half the stuff that we want to do. But I think that it's generational. Like, I would like to point that out, is that there are people who, and it's demographic. I don't want to tar everyone in the same brush, but you could almost wager, you could do the countdown to the first 10 negative comments will be from a certain type of person. And I'm sorry for having those, assumptions, but it tends out to be true. You just have to realize that for every one of those people, there are probably 10 people who, for the first time, if they hear it and they understand it correctly, will be really enthusiastic and activist for your brand. But I also think that you kind of need to take stock of everything that you've done. I mean, the lockdown has been, listen, it's probably been the same for you guys. I mean, every second day it's terrible. Like, you're thinking everything's gone to shit, and we're never going to make it out of here. And then you have a good day and you're like, oh my god, everything's amazing. And it's always to kind of just reflect back and go, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, where were we and where are we now? And if you extrapolate that, where could you be in 3 years time? But like, it's interesting that you're even saying that from a tree planting point of view, because one of the new brands that we're developing will tackle that issue, or feed into that issue for sure, in terms of climate repair. And it's to understand that there are probably, and that comes from my own self, is that if you look at BrewGooder as being super idiosyncratic, it's like me in a can. I had a water related illness and I drank beer, so I put the two of them together, right? That's it. There's no great, play in that. Whereas as a 30-year-old guy, like, I want to have a planet to exist on and to give over to my children or grandchildren, whatever it might be. So how can I then say, right, all this experience that I've had in BrewGooder, how can I point it in directions, for other things in sustainability? So is it anti-racism? Is it, climate repair? Is it female empowerment? Or can I do all of those things? And, when you get down from negative comments, or even just bad days, you kind of have to say, well, listen, you've built something that is active in the world, and it continues to be active in the world, and that's an absolute privilege to be involved in. So you kind of say to those people, a lot of whataboutery, if you understand, like, where people go, well, what about in this country? And I say, listen, mate, if you feel passionate about it, and it's a terrible disgrace that you think more money should be done, go out there and start something similar, and I'll back you. I'll give you all the help and mentorship you need to start an organization like ours that's fighting for something that you so passionately think that needs to be done.
I'm going to hold you to that, Alan.
Just don't be making bad comments on
No.
Facebook posts.
No. I mean, we actually we had a young activist prior to you was talking about some of the similar things you said. Like, one of the way he advocates for anti-slavery, which as like a 17-year-old, I was like, wow, that's a huge topic for you to take on.
Yeah.
But one interesting thing he said was just the preservation of mental health, and I think that extends to all of us as entrepreneurs, because you describe those situations so well, which is like one day it's great and the other day it's not. So I, like you, do have those skeleton drafts in my email inboxes, like like getting it all out at the
Yeah.
But I think also what people tend to forget, and I think it's kind of the problem, that because of the kind of society we live in, where everything is like immediate gratification or immediate response, that people don't take the time to reflect of all of the other impacts that a product does have, good and bad. So I love how you highlighted, do you want to tackle anti-racism? Do you want to tackle gender equality? But the way you illustrated it was so well, that your product already does those things, right? It's helping girls get to school, it's helping them have a better quality of education. So I think that's the really great takeaway for me, is that just, I love how you describe that. Just put two things together, and then through that you'll kind of see these radial effects of what you do. I mean, it's kind of what you guys at Gone West do as well, right, Wendy?
I think it's what we try to do.
but I think that's the key thing, is that, like, when you're talking about a 17-year-old tackling anti-slavery, in many ways it's like unusual, right? Yeah. But in many ways it's the future. I mean, if you look at the two activists that I would look up to, particularly, they are both young girls, and they are so Malala Yousafzai and I'm going to pronounce both their names horribly, because I know it's not Greta Thunberg, it's like Greta Thunberg or something like that there. But anyway, those two, right, are causing action on such an amazing scale that soon it will be, if a 50-year-old comes and tries to do something, the model of philanthropy, the model of activism is flipped on its head.
Yeah.
And I love it, because even as recently as when I was 25, the philanthropists, the people who were making the change, went through a certain trajectory, and it was, you make your money, and it doesn't matter how you make your money.
Yeah.
When you make your money, you start to give things back. And I know that there's people that I've been in very close contact with who built businesses on, if you were to set up a business like this, like that at now, and not even 20, 30 years later, you wouldn't do it, because it wouldn't be the way you would want to do it. And then they give back their money in a way that assuages all the negative stuff that were done. Whereas now you have these social entrepreneurs, that are building businesses, and even if they don't succeed, they're still trying to build a framework that is super, super sustainable from every single decision that they make as a business. Then they go on to make their impact. The same thing with activists, where you had like these celebrity, Bob Geldof type guys who decided that this was their calling after their music career or whatever, and fair play to them. But actually, people are starting from the grassroots and saying, I can see that this is a massive problem, and I'm young, and I've got a lifetime ahead of me to make an impact in this. Start now, start doing that. So by the time that guy's 17 or 21, from when he was 17, there's 4 years of understanding how organizations work, understanding leadership, understanding project management, understanding time management, understanding public speaking. The range of skills you can build for yourself, and then the amount of positive ripples you can cause, are extraordinary. So I'm really excited to see that soon down the line, a 30-year-old white guy drinking craft beer is going to be actually hopefully atypical of people who make a difference.
I love that. We're going to use that as your benchmark.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a very poignant point, and also I like that you highlighted that specific point about building business and then turning into a philanthropist, because I think that entrepreneurs like you, like James and Wendy, who run Gone West, you're activists in your own right. You've taken a different vehicle and, like you said, flipped it on its head and done the philanthropy as part of a central tenet of how you build a business. And so I'm like, more power to, entrepreneurial activists like you, because I just think the impact you've achieved in such a short space of time is truly, truly phenomenal. So yeah, well done.
Thank you.
And I think that's another thing, is that the way that philanthropy is philanthropic giving is distributed and managed across the world has a lot of question marks right now. There are a lot of fantastic programs out there, I just don't think if that's the way you're running your business with a act now and repair later, is not sustainable, and actually it doesn't have anywhere near the impact that you have as a business that at its core values is built around empowering communities and providing social natural capital. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer. You'd never get those, have the impact that you can have by running a sustainable business if you're going to just build now, act later.
Yeah, and I think that what then your subject matter changes, and I kind of want to try and bring this back onto water, I'm sure for the people tuning in, but you know, a social entrepreneur is not going to start an oil company, you know, they're not going to, it's almost like it precludes certain behaviors from then being addressed. I watched a game because we're in a moment of extreme financial and economic crisis. The film The Big Short, has anyone seen it? Yeah. So there's the main sort of guy that they follow, one of the main guys that they follow is a guy called Michael Burry, and he was the one who predicted it way before even everybody else in the film predicted it. And he only invests in one thing. Now, be that, you know, nefarious or privatization of it as a commodity, but it's water. You know, everything on our planet is based on this thing, and how we use and abuse it needs to be addressed. It needs to take account of emerging technologies, that, and from other sectors. You know, there has to be I don't know what the term is. There's a term in academics where it's like, you know, multidisciplinary? Is that correct? Yeah. So multi-sector almost, where you have to say, right, okay, if we are going to make this thing work, we need to analyze it from a data point of view, right? How do we get technology in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because what I want to be able to do in the future, and hopefully in the not too distant future, is to match every can with an impact on the other end, but to almost say that this is the well or whatever project this supports. This is the amount of water it's allowed to be accessed today or whatever. And then this was the last time that well was used, because in many occasions they will be used almost round the clock. So you can actually see that, you know, and that technology exists, but what it doesn't exist for is for a company like ours of, you know, sub £1 million turnover a year that has aspirations of doing it, but maybe can't. So how do we think in a way that's much, much bigger than what we do, to say, if we do the thing that we do to explain to our drinker how they've made an impact, what then are the implications for that, for the actual impact side of things? Could you then, in theory, take assets that are off grid and put them onto a grid, even in a very low tech way, so that suddenly that monitor and that thing is sending a message to say to make a drinker feel good about themselves in London, and it's also sending an SMS text message to say, you know, water level low to the people in that community, because in developing countries, you know, the mobile phone infrastructure is well beyond some of the other infrastructure. So how can you actually make those things super complementary?
I mean, you're speaking my language, Alan. That's all like Internet of Things, which is where I geek out completely. But, you know, to your point about how do you scale that, I think is a bit of a nemesis with being a founder, where you kind of think you have to do everything yourself. And when you envision an impact, you kind of think, because you visioned it, it's just going to have to happen through you. But I think that's why I kind of love the SDGs, because the SDG 17, which talks about partnerships, is to me a personal favorite, because it's kind of reframing how we think about how we collaborate. So it's like less competition, more collaboration. So, you know, what, like, for example, this campaign that the summit supports as Acorns to Oaks with Gone West and the Prince's Trust, that is exactly a similar thing. You know, I mean, Wendy, you can share a little bit about that, but it's kind of taking two entities and combining their resources to achieve greater outcomes, not just saving trees, but getting young people into forestry jobs over a period of time. So I just wanted to throw that in there, because I think sometimes people forget that, you know, especially founders, we don't have to do this all ourselves.
Totally. And I will have to go just in a few minutes, but I think the partnership thing is 100% correct, largely because I think that the model for how international development was done was broken as recently as the 2015 development goals, and you can especially see that in our limited area of impact, which is you had, the goal was to get effective water coverage to, you know, the population of places like Malawi, and what they did was there was just a rush to put things in the ground without the context, without the community buy-in, et cetera, et cetera. So you basically just wasted a lot of time and energy and money in order to achieve something that you could point to. And I think that the approach that we take, certainly, and that we work with on the ground, is you have to have that community buy-in for anything to be sustainable. You don't want to buy, you know, in a business side of things, you don't want to invest in assets that won't last you long enough. So why would you do so with the money that you've earned for the water side of things? And I think partnerships is there, and it's also self-emancipatory, if you like, where these communities are actually equal partners on their own development and their own progress, which I think is the big, you know, undermining factor. Is, you know, look at us, we've done X, Y, and Z for these poor people, and I think that's a key thing. So both in terms of working with other partners and actually making it happen, or understanding the stakeholders in the community as partners as well.
So before we let you go, we have one quite interesting question. So I have to put this for you. So it says, are consumers becoming more conscious when purchasing product? And if not, would you, Alan, be up for doing a BrewGooder festival?
Yeah, so every indicator is that with every, you know, subsequent generation that gets labeled, they are much more conscious of the purpose of a brand. So they might not net that now. So that's a bit of a catch-all term. That can mean why a company exists, not just to make profit, but to do other things. And that's not to say that it has to have a direct social or, you know, people-focused benefit, but that obviously is one of the most obvious and most emotive of those types of things. So if you look at, like, you know, McKinsey, the way I look at it, sorry, just a forethought to that. So if people like McKinsey, for example, are investing money in doing these reports, right, there's an agenda in it, right? Okay, so they see a business opportunity and they're willing to do something and put their name on it, or they've got clients that are in that space. So we can piggyback off, if you like. We like to say that we have a purpose not because marketing told us we have to have a purpose.
Correct, yeah.
We have a purpose because that's why we started. And if you look at it, you know, the investment in the research to find out if, you know, Unilever starts finding out that people aren't, you know, young people aren't buying their products anymore, or in less and less numbers. So why are they not doing that? They go out and spend a lot of money, find out that the reason they're not doing it is because they don't have a clearly definable and relatable purpose. Therefore, these big companies go and try and turn the oil tanker towards their purpose. So we can piggyback off that whole thing, you know, in terms of making better business decisions off that, you know, going and seeking investment for ourselves. So I think both anecdotally and quantitatively, absolutely, people are acting in a more ethical way. COVID will increase that because people will have less disposable income to spend, and therefore they will spend it, yes, based on price, but also based on values of the company. Why, with this money that I have, I'm not going to give it away to people that don't share similar values, or I can buy into an identifiable purpose. So I think that is absolutely the case, and it's only going to accelerate. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if there's more purpose-driven companies, then you have to be purpose-driven in order to compete. And then the whole thing tips over, and therefore you wouldn't start a company that is consumer-facing, certainly, and doesn't have a purpose. And then, is there a BrewGooder festival? Absolutely. We just need to make sure that it's done in the safest way possible, and we can make it as fun as enjoyable for everybody.
Well, you have your first 3 customers, me, Wendy, and the person who asked this question.
Nice one.
So,
okay.
That's all from the audience. So thank you so much, Alan.
Excellent. All right, guys. Thank you so much, and take care. All right.
Wonderful. Thanks. Bye for now.